As I like to say, the stage is now set. We've got the rotor bearings in, stack gear bearings in, and all the engine components are clean, which is great. So now that means we can start inserting seals and springs and all kinds of whimsical rotary stuff. But first things first, we've got to put the oil rings in. This consists of putting O-rings into the cassettes, and then before we put them into the rotors, we put the springs underneath, just so obviously they have something to hold them against the irons. It's not too bad to do. Like with all good things in life, it requires some Vaseline and some patience. So let me grab all the stuff we need and we will get on with that now. Everyone's favourite part when it comes to assembling these bad boys. So here we have some oil control rings. RX-8s have an extra one. They have what they call a cut-off ring. This reduces overlap between the ports on the side of the rotors because you can get some dilution between the two. Now, there's one of two things you can do here. You can either ditch it for even more braps at the exchange of efficiency, or you can keep it and just make a pretty gnarly port. So we're gonna do the latter. Now before I begin, there are 3 different springs all in all. You have got the outer one for your rotor, the inner, and the one in the middle. Now the 2 middle ones are the one that keep oil within the rotor, if that makes sense. And then the outer one is purely for emissions purposes and things like that. And the springs that go underneath are sided. The outer one doesn't matter so much, but the middle and the inner oil control ring springs definitely matter in terms of orientation. And I'll explain why in just a moment. So here we have the front rotor and the rear rotor. Notice how I've placed the front one up and the rear one down. That's because if you imagine the orientation of these rotors, front is going to be like that, rear is going to be like that. So the gears facing the outside of the engine, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, they actually rotate the same direction but in different orientations. This is going to determine which spring goes where. Now the only spring types I'm referring to are the white and the blue. White is going to be front of engine, blue is going to be rear of engine. But let me add some clarification to this. White is going to be front of engine, and if you imagine the engine spins clockwise, this means that the spring is going to drag a certain way underneath the oil control rings. These springs have a trailing edge and a leading edge. Now the white has the leading edge on the right hand side, the blue always has the leading edge on the other side. Now these are determined by the rounded edges of the spring. The flat edges of the spring are the trailing edges. These face upwards always. And the reason why the leading edge has a rounded edge is because it is meant to fall into this circle here. It's basically a little embossed circle that provides a stopping point for the spring. So, let me just put it there. If I press against the spring here, this cannot step over that little dot there. And as I was referring to the movement of the rotor, this is obviously a rear rotor. If it is spinning clockwise, naturally if this spring were held still, it would appear to go the opposite way on the rotor. So with that in mind, that stopper right there is going to prevent it from spinning, meaning it stays in place during normal operation. And it really is as simple as that, to be completely honest with you. The orientation of the rotor and the spring do matter. The outer spring, the pink spring, is a lot simpler than that. You can put it, so long as the colour is facing up, you can put it in without having to think about the orientation and things like that. So if I put this pink spring in there, you can see that there's already a pin for it there to hold it in place. This ensures that it stays in place and it doesn't spin left or right. It's held in place, which means the rings aren't going to get damaged on the underside. So I'll go ahead and put the other springs in place now that we've established which way they go in. And then we'll move on to the oil control rings. The springs are now in position. All that's left to do is insert the rings. The outer ring's pretty simple. It has a split in it. And it also has a cutout here, which is where the pin goes into place. Quite simple really. If it's not in the right position, it will stick up like a sore thumb. So let's pinch it together and stick it in the hole.
Giggity.
Onto the oil rings. Whoop. This is the part where you want to get some Vaseline. First and foremost, determine which one's the inner ring and which one's the outer ring. Little hint, the outer ring is generally a bit thinner. It's also bigger. That goes without saying. So I've divided them up now. Grab yourself an inner oil control ring. Get a smear of Vaseline in it. Feed it round. Can't really use too much, to be honest, but the whole point of this, not only is it a means of keeping the rubber against the ring, it also acts as a lubricant, so it essentially goes in a lot smoother without any snags. And then grab yourself an outer oil ring. Same thing, bit of lube. And then grab the cassette. This one's a little bit harder to do, but you don't want to stretch it as it goes in. And by that I mean put it in place and just walk it into the seal. You don't want it to twist, otherwise you will cause issues quite early on in the build. And then you'll get a little pinch point like that. Grab it, don't twist it, and just feed it into the cassette. Simples. So now that we've got two rings, we can start putting them in. Just a word of precaution, there's a little notch on the back of these oil control rings. Remember that trailing edge I told you about on the springs? Yeah, you guessed it, it goes right in between there. So take care when putting it into the rotor. So locate where the trailing edge is and put it on top. That's loosely on, and we do the same with the outer one. Find a little notch. There's two notches on each ring, so just bear that in mind, and stick that in there as well. Now these are loosely fitted. You can get like some sort of block, be it wood or just something clean, and jump on it to press it down into place. So what I like to do is get something relatively flat, relatively wide, and place it on top, give it a good press. And then if you really want to make sure it's in, flip it upside down and just press on the rotor. Now it doesn't always do it, but sometimes it will make a nice little click when it goes into place. In this case, it hasn't done it, but to verify that everything's in place, flip it over. The inner one will always protrude a little bit more than the others. Not sure why, but it does. And just make sure, get level, and just make sure that you can't really see the rubber ring bulging out or anything like that. Rinse and repeat for the other side. But before that, I'll just sort out the other rotor because I like to do it in pairs. once again a new day. The SD card was full and I didn't notice until after I finished putting in the rest of the rings. So yeah, we're gonna pick up from where we left off. We've now finished putting all the oil control rings in. They're nice and firmly in place. And now we're going to do the cool part, which is putting the corner seals and side seals in. There will be some clearance in, because there usually is one or two that need grinding, but essentially there should be enough there to show you the process at least. Let's get straight into it. Now, if you would like to come closer. These bad boys are now ready to receive the seals, side seals, corner seals, and the relevant springs. This part is actually quite therapeutic, I will say. You can just sort of get into the zone as you're putting all the springs in and then the seals, etc. Putting them in isn't really much of a process either. It can be a bit tedious if you've got loads of oversized side seals, because there's a lot of grinding involved. But for the most part, the biggest side seals that Mazda offers, which is the N3 Z5s, more often than not they meet the tolerances that you need without much effort. So the first thing you do is put the springs in. Now obviously it's 3 corner seals on one side, 3 side seals on a side. Literally just grab every single spring, put it in their respective places. And then once you've done that, you can put the seals into the relevant spots. We only do new here, just simply because we want these engines to last. Most things nowadays are individually bagged, so yeah, there's a lot of repetition in terms of getting all these seals out. That's a given. We'll start with these 6 for now. This may sound obvious, but make sure the orientation of the spring is correct. So obviously it's a bit of a horseshoe design. You just want to make sure that it's not going to overstep the mark in terms of getting in the way of the apex seal. Simples. And then once you've done that, just put the corner seal into place. There is a minimum projection amount, but if you're using all new parts, you should have no issue. The process for checking involves a feeler gauge. I think it's 0.4 millimeters or something like that. You just get your feeler gauge, lay it next to the corner seal, just get level with it and just see if the seal is taller than the feeler gauge in its relaxed position. Once it's in, make sure it returns nice and smoothly. If it doesn't, there's probably some sort of pinch point somewhere, in which case there's a couple of ways you can go about it. You can either lightly sand the areas. It's usually, if the rotor hasn't been dropped, it's usually around the side seal area. I think it kind of wears away at it or something along those lines. But essentially find out where it is, lightly sand or file the affected area that's preventing it from moving smoothly, and then just keep working away at it until just make sure it returns as normal. So, as these rotors have been machined to accommodate REW apex seals, which are the 2mm RX-8 apex seals, we actually have some different corner plugs to put into these corner seals. This allows the RX-8 apex seal to be used in this application. So, I've just got to swap them over. So these plugs are actually glued into place from factory, much like the corner pieces on the apex seal. So, it requires careful extraction. As for how I extract it, I get a housing, use one of these holes on the top, and I just get some sort of round screwdriver and press it in. And just like that, it comes out. Not much effort at all. Bit of Vaseline, smear it into the plug, stick the plug in. They only go in one way, so you can't really get it wrong. And just use an apex seal to straighten it before you stick it into the rotor. With that all adhered to, it will go in very nicely, and there you go. It is now in place. And it's just a case of rinse and repeat. You'll want to get all 3 into the rotor before you do anything else. Once they're in, I just like to enforce a habit, which is slide the apex seal in to avoid any unnecessary complications during assembly. Cool, that's all sorted. If you haven't already, get the corner seal spring out of your packaging, stick it in with the pink paint of the spring facing upwards. Quite simple. Get all three into position. Make sure these are in before you put the side seal in, because yeah, sometimes it's annoying getting the thing out. Alright then, side seal. As I said, N3Z5 is the biggest that Mazda do, other than the Mazda Speed ones, which are quite significantly oversized and require quite a bit of grinding. So, put your side seal into position. All seems fine there, that's got some movement. But the way we gauge that is with a feeler gauge. So, feeler gauge is 0.1 or 0.15 is what I tend to aim for nowadays, just simply because if you have too much clearance, not only do you lose a bit of compression, you also run the risk of snapping a side seal. And the reason why that happens, other than over temperature, which I'll mention in a bit, excessive hammering from side to side movement. If it gets enough momentum from the space, it basically keeps hammering at the end until something eventually breaks. Not ideal. So for a high revving engine, you want to aim for anything between 0.1 to 0.2. Obviously the tighter the better. All you've got to do is hold the side seal to one end and just have a feel. This is noticeably dragging on a 0.15, so I'm happy at that. That's not a problem. If we get another seal, do exactly the same thing. They only go in one way. They're tapered, unlike the other side seals that you get from Mazda. So once again, hold it to one side, bring your feeler gauge through, and that's nice right there. Awesome. Third side seal. In you go. Yeah, you can, when you've built enough engines, you can kind of feel roughly how much clearance there is. Little bit of drag on a 0.15. Let's switch up to a 0.2. Yeah, that's got a nice grab to it, so it's somewhere in that region. So the official way to measure side seal clearance as per Mazda is to grab a 0.15mm feeler gauge and stick it in the side seal groove on the outside, like so. Then once again you slide it to one side and you stick your feeler gauge in. But to be quite honest, holding the side seal against the rotor, well, towards the center of the rotor and against one side and against one corner seal is enough for me. It just makes things quicker. But yeah, the feeling, the measurement doesn't actually change. Use that information as you will, that's not a problem. 0.2 is a nice feeling right there. It's definitely grabbing, really nice and tight. And now, seal the deal with some Vaseline. Now you can't really use too much of this sort of stuff, but I will say try and keep it in the areas that it needs it. So obviously side seals, particularly on the corners, because that's where it's going to be needed most. So we've got the seals on one side of the rotor, now you want to flip it the other way. The Vaseline is useful here because it holds the seals in, as I said, and it prevents it from falling out during this process, as well as when you're assembling the engine. But as you can probably imagine, when you do flip it, you can't sit it down on the bench just because it will grab. All the seals will fall out and you'll end up chasing your tail. My personal favourite as a support is a crankshaft, provided it is clean. It wants to be clean anyway, that goes without saying, but place it down there. The diameter of the crank pulley is enough to support just the oil control rings. So without further ado, let's flip that over. And you can see there it's all supported, they aren't touching the side seals or anything like that. Rinse and repeat, grab your corner seal springs, align them into position, then go ahead, get some Vaseline, stick it into the corner seal, put your corner plug in, and then align the seal accordingly. Insert seal and make sure it springs back up and down. Perfect. And for reference here, as I said, I'm pretty sure it's about 0.5 mil projection or 0.4, but let's use 0.5 for obvious reasons. Get level with it and make sure that the seal is taller than the feeler gauge. And naturally make sure it doesn't get stuck. Awesome. More lube. Things are always better with a bit of Vaseline. Okay, so this side seal is a bit tighter than I'd like, so thankfully I get to show you the process of grinding it down. There's different ways in which people actually clearance a side seal. One of the most old school ways, I would say, is by using a lapping plate. So this is like a stone that's got a texture to it, almost equivalent to sandpaper, and you just rub the side seal against it until you get your desired clearance. The problem with that is it's inconsistent because the angle that you grind the side seal at ultimately determines the fitment. Now, if you're doing multiple side seals and things like that, it can get a bit tedious, and therefore the frustration leads to an improper angle, and then you could end up essentially wasting a side seal or not getting the desired clearance that you want. There is a tool for it designed by Extreme Rotaries now. It's pretty spenny, but definitely worth having. It's basically a little motorized die grinder, the correct shape to almost mimic the corner seal, if that makes sense. So you get a nice inverted rounded edge on the side seal, which ultimately meets the corner seal a lot better and provides good fitment and compression. The other method for, I guess, the hobbyist is by using a pillar drill. A pillar drill offers great consistency when it comes to grinding side seals, and it does this because it is a fixed drill, there is no movement, and you can get burrs and carbide bits and things like that that actually meet the same sort of diameter or very close to the similar diameter of a corner seal. So here we have my setup. It's just a basic pillar drill, nothing too fancy, and it has a Renesis rotor on the platform. All you do in this scenario is you bring the rotor right up to the bit, get it in position, and I use a quick clamp just to keep it in place. It's a simple setup, but definitely does the job. And when you're away, turn it on, and there you have it. Now, it wasn't out by much, so we shouldn't require too much grinding. Now, be sure to grab an old side seal spring and make sure that's in there as well, and just gently grind away. It can make light work of grinding, so just be wary. That looks like the proper clearance now. There we go, 0.15's a nice grab right there. Got nice movement between both seals, the spring nice and freely. Excellent. We are in business. Might be a bit difficult to see, but notice the rounded edge on the side seal. That's exactly what we want, and that allows for good fitment, good clearance, etc. So we're done there. Once again, Vaseline, seal the deal. Get that shit in there. With everything all lubed up, it's time to set this rotor to the side. Like I said, therapeutic. It's a really enjoyable process, especially when you're taking your time with it and you have the environment for it. It's almost as satisfying as putting the whole thing together, you know, the fruits of your hard work and whatnot. And for anyone that is building their engine currently, I do hope that these tips and tricks have saved you a bit of time and helped you understand the process a little bit better. I'm just going to go ahead and finish the second rotor, and then we'll continue with the build.